guys, welcome to A Safe Place to Learn the Good and the Bad with Alicia. Today I'm going to be reviewing Chapter 12 of Governing Texas, Public Policy. After reviewing this chapter, we should be able to answer the following questions. Describe the key steps and concepts in the policymaking process. Describe the major issues that have shaped education policy in Texas. Describe the state's role in addressing poverty and how it's affected by national policies. And explain why Medicaid in particular and healthcare policy in general have been so controversial in Texas. Public policy is the means by which the government addresses the needs of its citizens, including protecting those who cannot protect themselves, one of the most important responsibilities of the state. The state leaves the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services in charge of these responsibilities. They're also known as DFPS and also run the Child Protective Services, aka CPS. Despite its importance, DFPS has been severely understaffed. In 2011, a New York-based advocacy group brought a class action suit on behalf of all children in long-term care in Texas. U.S. District Judge Janice Jack of Corpus Christi found that excessive caseloads and overburdened caseworkers caused an unreasonable risk of harm to foster children. The court also found that almost 3,000 at-risk children were either seen by caseworkers outside of the required 24-hour period following a report of possible abuse or not seen at all. The judge concluded that the state had violated a substantive due process right under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that foster children must be free from an unreasonable risk of harm caused by the state. The court ordered DFPS to implement reforms that protected children and directed the agency to hire enough caseworkers to ensure that caseloads were manageable. Years of inaction led Judge Jack sending a court-appointed special master to keep an eye on CPS, arguing that Texas couldn't be trusted to protect children under the care of the state. The national government can contribute funds and regulate aspects of public policy areas. It's been uncertain how the issues would be resolved, but it was clear that the reform would happen. The failures of CPS to protect its wards and the legislative and judicial responses to the CPS crisis are good examples as to why public policy matters in Texas. Public policy is the express goals of a governmental body backed by incentives and sanctions which are found in laws passed by a legislature or in the rules and regulations of authorized public agencies. The incentives or sanctions can include subsidies that reward people for acting in a certain way, admonitions, and monetary or criminal penalties that punish people. The policy-making process can be broken down into several stages: problem identification, policy formation, implementation, and evaluation. The stages in the process aren't linear and may overlap. In the first stage of policymaking, societies and policymakers develop an understanding of how we think about and address a particular problem. A systemic agenda is used by citizens and policymakers to understand the nature of public problems and to shape and direct the way policymakers will develop public policy aimed at them. Ideology plays a key role in how the issue is handled throughout the policymaking process. In the second stage, the general ideas about the problem are clarified and strategies to address the problem are developed. Policy formulation involves the passage of legislation and the development of administrative rules and regulations. Setting the agenda on what problems will be discussed, how these problems will be understood, and what concrete measures will be taken to address them lies at the heart of all policy formulations. In the third stage, the goals of the public policy are put into place with incentives or sanctions to support them. The right agency and budget plays a big role in how successful a public policy is. In the fourth stage, the policy must be evaluated for effectiveness. Good evaluations can result in clarifying the objectives of the policy and the resources used to implement it. An additional stage, legitimation, is the formal recognition in the political community of the legality and constitutionality of the policy initiative. It's probably better understood as something that takes place throughout the entire policymaking process. Legitimation can include open discussions of a problem in the press, committee investigations and oversight investigations, following the appropriate rules for passing a bill in the legislature, or making a rule in an administrative agency and judicial review of the policy. People are usually surprised by how irrational and inefficient public policy can seem in a democracy. Part of the problem is that the policymaking process is very complex. Writing reports, holding committee hearings, and passing legislation involve political compromises that muddy the water. Rationality is the idea in public policymaking that we have clearly identified goals and that we seek to achieve these goals in an optimal or efficient manner. There are many things working against rationality, including an incremental policymaking process, and people may not behave strictly rationally or efficiently. Bounded rationality is the idea that in policymaking, decision makers may seek solutions to problems that are satisfactory to them, but not necessarily optimal or efficient. Three policy areas shape political life in Texas: education, welfare, and healthcare. Education policy in Texas involves overlapping problems that are addressed by local, state, and federal policies. Education is big business in Texas. Billions go into public education. As of 2018, there were 1,023 regular school districts in Texas, with almost 9,000 public schools. Along with the regular school districts, there's over 700 open enrollment charter school campuses as of 2016-2017. State school districts employ over 342,000 teachers, almost 26,000 administrators, and almost 70,000 professional support staff, which includes counselors, librarians, and nurses. On top of that, they employed another 235,000 educational aides and auxiliary staff. Texas ranked 36th in per capita student expenditure in 2016-2017, a fall from 24th in 1998. Charter schools are an alternative to traditional public schools, usually because the public schools have failed to meet needs of certain groups of students. While there are many challenges in educational policy in Texas, there are a few that stand out, like the low level of public spending per pupil. The demographics are not only increasingly minority, but also increasingly disadvantaged. And Texas students have high dropout rates, particularly among Latinos and African Americans, which affects state and federal efforts to address problems of poverty. The Republic of Texas Constitution required a system of public schools, but the creation of and funding for these schools was not addressed outside the local level until the 20th century. Public education was to be financed with a part of the $10 million given to Texas by the U.S. government to settle outstanding land claims in parts of which are now New Mexico, Colorado, and Oklahoma. Unfortunately, the fund was diverted to a variety of other purposes. When Democrats returned to power following Reconstruction, an effort was made to protect the fund and commit its use solely to education. The Constitution of 1876 also had provisions to support public education through various state and local taxes. Many school systems were chronically short of funds, facing such problems as a shortage of supplies and textbooks, inadequate facilities, and poorly trained teachers. In 1949, the state legislature passed the Gilmer-Aiken laws to address these problems. School districts were consolidated into 2,900 administrative units. State equalization funding was provided to supplement local taxes. Teachers' salaries were raised, and a minimum school year of 175 teaching days was established. In addition, the laws established the Texas Education Agency, or TEA, originally known as the State Department of Education, to supervise public education in the state. The State Board of Education became the policy-making body for public education, selecting budgets, establishing regulations for school accreditation, executing contracts for the purchase of textbooks, and investing in the permanent school fund. The board also has the power to appoint a commissioner of education, subject to the confirmation by the Texas Senate, who serves a 4-year term as the chief executive officer of the TEA. The TEA is responsible for setting standards for public schools and for handling federal funds related to public education. 3 specific problems have played a large role in education policy in Texas over the last 50 years: desegregation, equity in funding, and the search for educational excellence. Segregation of the races was provided for under the Texas Constitution of 1876 and upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 through the separate but equal doctrine. In the 1920s and 30s, Texas spent an average of 1/3 less per student on the education of African American students than on white students. Segregated schools were separate but not equal. That was up until the landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which ruled that state-imposed segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. School districts were instructed to desegregate with all deliberate speed. San Antonio's school district was one of the first to comply in the nation, but other places in the state like Houston moved much slower. In 1957, the Texas legislature passed laws encouraging school districts to resist federally ordered desegregation, but legal segregation ended by the late 1960s. De facto segregation still persists, mainly in urban areas with large minority populations. Many middle and upper income whites in Texas abandon urban public school systems for suburban public schools or private schools. School funding has been a pervasive issue, largely fought out in the courts. In addition to Brown v. Board of Education, 2 later court cases have played a major role in shaping education policy and politics in Texas over the last 50 years. San Antonio v. Rodriguez and Edgewood ISD v. Kirby. San Antonio v. Rodriguez in 1973 challenged the constitutionality of funding public schools with property taxes. The Edgewood ISD had one of the highest property tax rates in the country, but it could only raise $37 per pupil. Meanwhile, the neighboring school district of Alamo Heights was able to raise $413 per pupil with a much lower tax rate because the properties were nicer. A federal district court ruled that the Texas school finance system violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court resulted in a ruling that the clause did not require states to subsidize poorer school districts. Edgewood ISD v. Kirby in 1989 challenged school funding with respect to the Texas Constitution's provision of a general diffusion of knowledge and an efficient system of free public schools. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund sued William Kirby, the state commissioner of education at the time, on behalf of Edgewood ISD and eventually 67 other school districts. They argued that the state's reliance on local property taxes to fund schools discriminated against poor children by denying them equal opportunities in education. The Texas Supreme Court held the funding system in violation of the Texas Constitution's Efficiency Clause. Although it did not demand absolute equality in per-pupil spending, the court did require a standard of substantially equal access to similar revenues per pupil at similar levels of tax effort. It ordered the legislature to implement an equitable system by the 1990-91 school year. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the legislature responded with various funding plans. The Robin Hood Plan transferred funds from rich to poor districts. In 2016, an all-Republican court stated that its job was not to second-guess the legislature when it came to the best funding of public education, and that funding met the minimum constitutional provisions for the general diffusion of knowledge. The Democratic Supreme Court of the 1980s had focused on constitutional issues of fairness and efficiency in the funding of public schools. The Republican Court of 2016 focused on whether or not the funding provided a constitutionally acceptable general diffusion of knowledge throughout the state. This decision had 2 immediate effects. First, state courts were taken out of the policymaking process regarding financing public education for the first time since the original Edgewood decision in 1989. Second, the debate over equity and financing public education was pushed firmly into the legislative budgetary process. The burden of funding public schools continues to shift from the state to local funding. In 2008, the state covered 48.5% of the cost, and in 2019, state support had dropped to 38%. This shift has prompted the legislature to now address rising property taxes. A special finance commission was set up to hold hearings around the state and deliver a report on the problems of funding public education before the legislative session in 2019. General revenue monies are now used to address some of the inequities of the system, but funding in public education is still unresolved to some degree. The focus on educational excellence and accountability in Texas was prompted by a 1983 national report on the state of public education in the nation. Test scores were declining and functional literacy was on the rise, prompting the state legislature to establish the Select Committee on Public Education, or SCOPE, to address teacher pay and to evaluate the public school system in Texas. The chair of the committee argued that athletic programs were misplaced priorities, and the committee eventually recommended 140 reforms, including guidelines for student attendance and performance, tighter accreditation standards, and a controversial no pass, no play policy targeting athletics. Many reform proposals were implemented with tax increases in 1984. Accountability through testing became the education policy debate in 1995. The Perot reforms had generally centralized control over education policy in the state. The Bush reforms, in contrast, gave more discretion to local school districts to achieve the educational goals that the state was mandating. Local control of public schools was increased by limiting the power of the TEA. Local voters were empowered to adopt home charters that could free their school districts from many state requirements. Students under certain circumstances could transfer from low-performing schools to high-performing schools in their district, promoting competition among schools by holding them accountable for the performance of their students. Statewide assessment standards were developed, starting with the Texas Educational Assessment of Minimal Skills, or TEAMS, then the Texas Assessment of Academic Skills, or TAS, then TAKS, the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills. TAKS was replaced by the State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness, or STAR, in 2011, requiring students to pass 15 end-of-course exams in grades 9 through 12. The hope was to increase standards and quality of education. However, failure rates remained high, and teachers and administrators complained about the need to teach to the test. In 2013, under House Bill 5, the state legislature cut the number of required end-of-course tests from 15 to 5. In 2015, the state legislature moved toward an accountability system that would evaluate schools on an A through F scale, replacing the old pass or fail system. Many educators rejected the scale, arguing that it relied too much on the standardized tests that were still being given rather than how the schools were improving. In 2017, the legislature tried again and finally passed a compromise bill on the last day of the session that proposed to evaluate schools on 3 dimensions: student achievement, student progress, and a closing the gaps measure. Elementary and middle schools would focus on the results of standardized state exams, while high schools would look at graduation rates and the rates of students taking advanced courses. No one's really satisfied with the solutions, and public education is likely to be a topic on legislative sessions for years to come. Despite attempts to address issues in education, Texas's policymakers have continued to identify new problems. Teachers' salaries, local spending, and test scores have remained low compared to national averages, and there's a growing achievement gap that shows minorities and at-risk students failing at higher rates than white students. Although the dropout rate in grades 7 through 12 has been declining since the 1990s, it's remained high among minorities. With the implementation of more rigorous STAR assessments, overall student performance stayed flat or fell on various tests. The idea behind vouchers is to increase competition by allowing the money to follow the students. If a public school doesn't work, let parents and students opt out of it and take their funding with them. Open enrollment charter schools funded by the state and private monies are meant to make more options available in areas where schools are underperforming. Charter schools have increased flexibility to deliver education to student populations with special needs. Charter schools work under their own charters and are granted the freedom to manage their own schools. Charter schools operate under the TEA and receive their own accountability ranking based on test scores. Critics of both vouchers and charter schools argue that the money will be drained from public schools, leaving poorer students behind. Some argue the only way to address education policy in Texas is by spending more money, with a focus on increasing teacher pay. The idea is education will right itself with the best and most qualified in the classroom. Vouchers and charter schools are seen as threats to this alternative. The public appears to be in favor of increased expenditures going to public education, but it splits along partisan lines. One of the problems facing policymakers in the future will be formulating reform proposals amid a divided electorate. Another long-term policy issue in Texas has been providing the basic needs of poor people, raising questions about the state's role in helping people in poverty and the extent to which national policies determine the state's response to the needs of the poor. Welfare policy shows how changes in problem identification and formulation can lead to an overhaul in policy implementation and evaluation. Poverty is defined as the condition under which individuals or families do not have the resources to meet their basic needs, including food, shelter, healthcare, transportation, and clothing. It's always been a hot topic in Texas because of the individualistic culture. Although there is considerable controversy as to whether it adequately measures the minimal needs of a family, the poverty index is the generally accepted standard against which poverty is measured. In 2016, 15.6% of Texans lived below the poverty line, and many were eligible for the over 200 welfare and anti-poverty programs administered by the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, despite the thriving Texas economy. A study conducted by the Henry J. Kaiser Foundation in 2016 found that over 23% of Latinos, 22% of African Americans, and 10% of whites in Texas are poor. The Texas Health and Human Services Commission has overseen the Department of Family and Protective Services, the Department of Assistive and Rehabilitative Services, the Department of Aging and Disability Services, and the Department of State Health Services since 2003. It's responsible for coordinating, determining eligibility for, and administering the major welfare and anti-poverty programs in Texas, including temporary assistance to needy families, Medicaid, SNAP, and other programs to address family violence, provide disaster relief, and settle refugees. Two of the most important initiatives are welfare and healthcare financing. The modern welfare policy stems from President Franklin Roosevelt's 1930s programs to stimulate the national economy and provide relief to victims of the Great Depression, the New Deal. The Social Security Act of 1935 transformed the way in which welfare policy was implemented in the United States. It established the old age insurance, unemployment insurance, and a number of state federal public assistance programs, like Aid for Dependent Children, which was later changed to Aid to Families with Dependent Children, Old Age Assistance, and Aid for the Blind. States administered and determined the benefit levels for these programs. However, in exchange for federal assistance and funding, the programs had to meet certain minimum federal guidelines. The Department of Public Welfare was established in Texas in 1939 to run the state's various public assistance programs, and until the 1960s, their strategy was to maximize federal dollars while minimizing state funding of programs. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty created a number of social service programs. One of these programs was Medicaid, a federal and state program financing medical services to low-income people. Federal court decisions ended state-level policies that had been used by states to keep welfare rolls low. The Texas Department of Public Welfare, now the Health and Human Services Commission, was tasked with administering these public assistance programs, including the Supplemental Security Income Program, which aids low-income elderly or disabled individuals, and a number of others. The number of Texans participating in welfare programs increased dramatically throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as did expenditures on these programs. The numbers continue to rise in both Texas and the nation, as there has been no success in attempting to reform welfare. By the mid-1980s, there was backlash to what was viewed as incentive structures in welfare policy, resulting in Texas seeking a waiver from federal regulations to experiment with reform. Many believe that the policies of the 1960s backfired and created a dysfunctional underclass of people dependent on welfare. Some argued that while programs may help in the meantime, in the long run it would result in people lacking the character traits and moral values that would enable them to succeed. Many also believed there were women having children just to earn more money, and that fathers were encouraged to abandon their families. These critics decided the poor needed encouragement and proper incentives to become independent workers rather than having a permanent source of income from the state. In 1988, the Family Support Act mandated that all state AFDC programs covered two-parent homes, established new workforce programs, and set standards requiring parents to participate or lose their benefits. Welfare continued to expand, though, so in 1995, a bipartisan reform was passed, promoting education and job training programs aimed to weaning welfare recipients off welfare. The incentives to get off welfare included a limitation on benefits to 36 months, alimony for ex-spouses in poverty who couldn't support themselves, and a 5-year ban on reapplying for benefits once they ran out. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families was passed to provide temporary assistance to families with needy children, seeking to make poor families self-sufficient and to give states greater flexibility in setting benefit levels, eligibility requirements, and other program details. They cannot receive this assistance for more than 36 months, but they are also eligible for Medicaid benefits, food stamps, and child daycare services. Unless legally exempt, recipients are also required to participate in an employment services program, attend parenting skills classes, get vaccines for their children, make sure their children go to school, and agree not to abuse drugs or alcohol. The success of welfare reforms is evaluated in terms of the degree to which they have helped lower the number of welfare recipients in Texas and the degree to which they have succeeded in taking people off welfare and moving them into the workforce. While the number of welfare recipients in Texas has declined, the degree to which they have succeeded in taking people off welfare and moving them into the workforce has fluctuated. Public spending on monetary assistance programs such as the TANF has declined sharply over the last 20 years as the number of people enrolled in the program has declined. On the other hand, funding for non-cash assistance programs has more than tripled during the same time period. Poverty has not been eliminated, but the way Texas addresses the needs of poor people in the state has moved from cash assistance to social services. Health insurance is a major policy problem facing Texas. In 2016, an estimated 15% of Texans were uninsured, the highest percentage of any state. Medicaid is a joint federal-state program which provides health care for the poor, especially poor children. Almost $62 billion was spent on Medicaid in Texas from 2018 to 2019. Funding Medicaid is a major issue in the debate over the state and national government's roles in providing health care. In implementing Medicaid, states are required to meet certain standards if they want to receive federal funding for the program. Standards include Medicaid services must be available on a statewide basis. The same level of service must be available to all clients throughout the state, with children being entitled to a broader range of services than adults. Participants must be allowed to use any healthcare provider who meets program standards as long as the provider accepts Medicaid. And finally, the amount, duration, and scope of medical services must be sufficiently reasonable. Waivers of these standards are granted to give states freedom in meeting the needs of certain clients, such as managed care organization models. Texas has been granted the authority to enroll clients in managed care programs. In managed care organizations, or MCOs, programs such as health maintenance organizations or doctor-hospital networks act as intermediaries between the patient and the doctor and negotiate discounted fees for services. MCOs reimburse their member healthcare providers with a monthly payment, which is known as a capitation payment because of its limit or cap based on medical expenses calculated for the average patient. The State of Texas Access Reform Program, or STAR, is the managed care program run by the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, under which the state contracts with MCOs to provide health care in various areas to poor populations in Texas. Traditional Medicaid enables Medicaid recipients to receive medical services from a primary care provider and can be found primarily in rural areas in Texas. Primary care providers receive fee-for-service reimbursement and a small monthly management fee directly from the state. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Medicaid was expanded to include older adults not fully covered by Medicare, people with disabilities, and pregnant women. Those participating in TANF and SSI automatically qualify for Medicaid. Enrollment fluctuates monthly with eligibility requirements affected by a variety of factors like when a parent or caregiver has a change in income, when a child is born, or when a child reaches a certain age. 77% of those on Medicaid are under the age of 20, 51% on Medicaid are Latino, 19% are white, and 15% are African American. Medicaid is administered through the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, which with federal agencies monitors Texas's program and sets standards. Medicaid pays for a variety of healthcare services for a number of low-income populations. The federal portion of financing is based on a complicated formula with poorer states receiving a larger share of assistance. In Texas, children whose families' income are too high to qualify for Medicaid can receive benefits from the Children's Health Insurance Program, also known as CHIP. CHIP is administered like Medicaid through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Medicaid and CHIP expenditures have become an increasing part of both the national and the state budgets. Funding for healthcare is a controversial issue, with politicians arguing over who should pay for it and what should be covered. In 2012, a conflict over Planned Parenthood receiving Medicaid funding broke out, leading to a lengthy court battle and debate over the federal-state relationship. By March 2012, all federal funding of the Texas Women's Health Program had been pulled. In May 2012, the issue became even more complicated. 8 Planned Parenthood clinics that did not provide abortion services sued the state, claiming their rights to freedom of speech and freedom of association had been violated. A federal appeals court ruled on August 22, 2012, that Texas could ban Planned Parenthood from receiving funds. The conflict over the funding and administration of the Texas Women's Health Program signals the emergence of a new set of conflicts over Medicaid in Texas and a new round in the debate over the relationship between national and state government and the federal system. Cost is the single most important issue confronting policymakers regarding Medicaid in Texas. Making up more than 25% of the state expenditures, Medicaid in Texas threatens to overwhelm the budget. There have been 2 strategies over the past 20 years. First, to bring more efficiency into the program by expanding managed care initiatives across the state, and second, to institute cost controls and cutbacks to providers. Both efforts have had limited success, and at the same time, they have sparked concern over the quality of care being offered to Medicaid participants across the state. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was passed by Congress in 2010 to expand the number of people with health insurance. However, it came with individual mandates and Medicaid expansion mandates, both of which were challenged in court. The legislation requires individuals not covered by existing plans to pursue health insurance or pay a penalty. The act also increased coverage for pre-existing conditions and expanded medical insurance to an estimated 30 million people at the time. A majority of the states, including Texas, and a number of private individuals and groups challenged the constitutionality of the act in court, focusing on the mandatory coverage provisions. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that for federalism to thrive, states had to have a meaningful and real choice as to whether or not they would participate in federally sponsored programs. Governor Rick Perry and the state legislature chose to not expand funding for Medicaid, forgoing millions of federal dollars. The debate over healthcare funding continues in Texas because Texas still has the highest rate of uninsured people in the nation. Texas's refusal to participate in the optional state-federal expansion of Medicaid has effectively denied insurance coverage to many poor people. In this chapter, we learned about public policy in Texas. We learned about public policy in public education, welfare, and healthcare. The process of making public policy includes problem identification, policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation. Public policy changes as the economy changes. The legislature will have to deal with funding and fairness in public education. Charter schools likely will continue to expand. Poverty policy will continue to be the poor child of public policy, and healthcare remains the wild card. Let's review our objectives. Describe the key steps and concepts in the policymaking process. Public policies are the outcomes of governmental institutions. There are a number of stages in the policymaking process. One stage is problem identification, where political actors and society at large develop an understanding of a problem and how that problem can be addressed. The second stage in the process is policy formulation, where strategies for dealing with specifically defined problems are developed. The third stage is policy implementation, where the goals of public policy along with sanctions to support them are put into effect by a particular government agency. A fourth stage of the process is evaluation, where efforts are made to evaluate the effectiveness of a policy. Some political scientists argue that there's still another stage in the process called legitimation, where the legality of a particular policy initiative is determined. Describe the major issues that have shaped education policy in Texas. One of the most important functions of state government is providing and funding public education. Under the Gilmer-Aiken laws, Texas extended its control over financing and administering public education through local school districts. As in many southern states, segregation of public schools was a major problem that was not dealt with until federal courts forced Texas to desegregate in the 1950s and 60s. Equity in the funding of public education remains a major issue in Texas. State courts continue to play an important role in addressing the equity issue. Concerns over excellence and accountability in public education persist today. Describe the state's role in addressing poverty and how it is affected by national policies. Texas has large numbers of people living in poverty who have received governmental assistance since the New Deal. When the Social Security Act of 1935 was passed, Texas's most important welfare program was AFDC. President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty expanded social welfare programs for the poor in the 1960s. But compared with other states, welfare benefits remained low in Texas. Concerns over the problem of welfare dependency led to major reforms at the national level in 1996 when AFDC was replaced with TANF. Since these reforms, welfare rolls have declined, although poverty has remained a chronic problem among a significant portion of Texas population. And finally, explain why Medicaid in particular and healthcare policy in general have been so controversial in Texas. One major welfare program that has become increasingly costly is Medicaid, a state-federal program that finances healthcare for the poor. Reforms instituted under the Obama administration have significantly expanded healthcare coverage for the poor. Texas, however, is not participating in that expansion. The rising cost of Medicaid is seen by many conservatives to be a growing threat to the financial integrity of the state's budget. All right, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned something new today. Please remember to like and subscribe down below. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.